What happens when a corrupt lord tries to break the most honorable knight in the realm? When Sir Aldrich Ravencrest was chained in a dungeon and tortured for 3 days, Lord Blackmore was certain he could force him to betray everything he stood for. The corrupt lord had perfected a system of manipulation that had never failed. Find what someone loves most, threaten it, and watch them crumble. But he had never encountered a knight whose honor meant more to him than life itself. This isn't just another story about medieval torture or political corruption. This is the incredible tale of how one word, spoken with absolute conviction, became more powerful than threats, torture, and even death itself. A story that proves sometimes the greatest strength comes not from what you're willing to do, but from what you absolutely refuse to do, no matter the cost. Sir Aldrich faced an impossible choice: betray his lord to save his tortured squire, or watch an innocent young man suffer for his principles. What he did next didn't just save his own soul. It exposed a network of corruption and inspired a transformation that changed an entire kingdom. Today I'm going to tell you how a single word, spoken in the darkest moment, became a rallying cry for honor that echoed through history. How one knight's refusal to compromise proved that individual courage can triumph over systematic corruption. But first, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? I love seeing our global community grow. And if you're ready for a story that shows the true meaning of honor, the power of standing firm in your principles, and how one person's courage can change everything, smash that like button and subscribe with notifications on. Because what Sir Aldrich discovered about the power of saying, "No," will prove that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords, but with unshakable moral conviction. Are you ready to witness true honor in action? Sir Aldrich Ravencrest knelt in the cold stone chamber beneath Thornwall Castle, his wrists bound with iron shackles that had worn bloody grooves into his flesh over the past 3 days of captivity. The 32-year-old knight bore the weathered features of a man who had spent 15 years in service to various lords throughout the kingdom, but his steel-gray eyes still held the unwavering conviction that had made him legendary among common soldiers and respected even by enemies who had faced him in battle. Despite the degrading circumstances of his imprisonment, he maintained the dignified bearing of a man whose honor was worth more to him than his life. Lord Voss Blackmore stood before the chained knight, his corpulent frame draped in expensive silks that could not disguise the corruption that had rotted his soul over decades of political manipulation and moral compromise. At 58, he controlled one of the largest and most strategically important territories in the northern reaches of the kingdom, but his power had been built through systematic betrayal of allies, extortion of subordinates, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that viewed honor as a luxury that weak men could not afford. His pale blue eyes studied Sir Aldrich with the calculating gaze of a predator who had identified exactly what leverage would be necessary to break his prey's resistance. "Sir Aldrich," Lord Blackmore began, his voice carrying the oily smoothness of a man who had perfected the art of making reasonable proposals that concealed devastating moral traps. "I trust that 3 days of contemplation in these accommodations have given you time to reconsider your previous inflexibility regarding the terms of service I have offered you. Surely a knight of your experience understands that absolute principles are a luxury that cannot be maintained when the practical realities of survival are at stake." The chamber was designed to break the spirit of prisoners through a combination of physical discomfort and psychological pressure that had proven effective against even the most determined opponents of Lord Blackmore's will. The stones wept with moisture that made the air heavy and unwholesome, while the only light came from a single torch that cast dancing shadows across walls stained with the evidence of previous interrogations. The isolation was complete, broken only by the daily visits from Lord Blackmore himself, who seemed to take personal pleasure in the systematic erosion of whatever principles his prisoners might once have held. Sir Aldrich raised his head to meet his captor's gaze directly, his voice steady despite the physical weakness that came from 3 days of minimal food and water. "Lord Blackmore, my answer remains the same as it was when you first made your proposal. I will not participate in the assassination of Lord Garrett Thornfield, nor will I provide intelligence that would enable others to carry out such a dishonorable act. If you require my death to proceed with your plans, then so be it, but you will not have my cooperation in betraying a man who has shown me nothing but respect and fair treatment." The refusal was delivered with the quiet dignity of a man who had faced similar choices before and had always chosen the path that allowed him to sleep peacefully regardless of the consequences that might follow. Sir Aldrich had sworn sacred oaths of knighthood that bound him to serve with honor, protect the innocent, and maintain loyalty to those who deserved it, and no amount of physical suffering or threats of death could compel him to violate principles that defined his very identity. Lord Blackmore's expression darkened as he contemplated the stubborn resistance of a man who should have been grateful for the opportunity to preserve his life through a simple act of cooperation that would benefit everyone involved. Sir Aldrich, I fear you misunderstand both the nature of my offer and the consequences of continued defiance. This is not merely a request for your assistance in a political matter. It is your final opportunity to demonstrate that you possess the practical wisdom necessary to preserve not only your own life but the lives of others who depend on your decisions. The threat was delivered with the kind of casual menace that Lord Blackmore had perfected through years of manipulating people who believed they could maintain their principles while operating in a world that rewarded only results. He had learned that every man possessed pressure points that could be exploited to achieve compliance, and he was confident that Sir Aldrich's legendary sense of responsibility for others would prove to be the lever that would finally break his resistance to reasonable cooperation. You see, Sir Aldrich, Lord Blackmore continued, beginning to pace around the chained knight with the predatory grace of a wolf circling wounded prey, your continued defiance has forced me to expand the scope of our negotiations to include certain additional considerations that I had hoped would not be necessary. Your former squire, young Thomas Ashworth, has been taken into custody on suspicion of collaborating with your treasonous activities. The evidence against him is, I must admit, rather circumstantial, but given the current political climate, circumstantial evidence has proven quite sufficient for conviction in cases involving threats to regional stability. The mention of Thomas caused Sir Aldrich's composure to crack for the first time since his imprisonment began, his eyes widening with a mixture of rage and desperation as he realized that Lord Blackmore had identified exactly the kind of leverage that might force him to compromise principles he had never before considered negotiable. Thomas Ashworth was barely 19 years old, the son of a farmer who had shown exceptional promise as a warrior, and had earned his position as Sir Aldrich's squire through demonstrated courage and unwavering dedication to the ideals of knighthood. Thomas has done nothing wrong, Sir Aldrich said, his voice tight with controlled emotion as he struggled against the iron shackles that held him helpless while an innocent young man faced punishment for crimes that existed only in Lord Blackmore's imagination. He is guilty of nothing more than loyalty to his knight and dedication to the principles we have both sworn to uphold. If you require a life to satisfy your political necessities, take mine and let the boy go free. Lord Blackmore smiled with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally maneuvered his quarry into an inescapable trap, understanding that he had found the exact combination of pressure and incentive that would force even the most principled knight to choose pragmatic compromise over abstract idealism. Sir Aldrich, I have no desire to see young Thomas come to harm, any more than I wish to see you suffer needlessly in these uncomfortable accommodations. The solution to both problems is remarkably simple and requires nothing more than your agreement to provide certain strategic information that will enable the resolution of a political problem that threatens the stability of this entire region. Lord Blackmore gestured for his guards to bring forward a wooden chair, settling his considerable bulk into it with the air of a man preparing for a lengthy negotiation that he was confident would conclude in his favor. The psychological pressure of forcing Sir Aldrich to look up at him from his kneeling position was a calculated element of the intimidation process, designed to reinforce the fundamental power imbalance that made resistance ultimately futile regardless of whatever moral convictions the knight might possess. Let me explain the broader context that necessitates your cooperation, Sir Aldrich, Lord Blackmore began, his tone shifting to that of a patient teacher instructing a slow student in basic realities that should have been obvious to anyone with practical intelligence. Lord Garrett Thornfield has become an obstacle to a peace treaty that would end 3 years of border conflicts and save thousands of lives throughout this region. His stubborn insistence on maintaining territorial claims that have no basis in current political reality has prolonged a war that serves no one's interests except his own inflated sense of honor. The explanation was delivered with the practiced smoothness of a man who had learned to present selfish motivations as altruistic concerns for the greater good, a skill that had enabled him to justify decades of moral compromise as necessary sacrifices for the welfare of people who were too naive to understand the harsh realities of political leadership. Lord Blackmore genuinely believed that his willingness to make difficult decisions that squeamish men avoided made him a more effective protector of his people's interests than those who allowed abstract principles to interfere with practical problem-solving. Sir Aldrich listened to the explanation with the expression of a man who had heard similar justifications before and had learned to recognize the self-serving logic that allowed corrupt individuals to convince themselves that their crimes were actually virtuous sacrifices for the common good. Lord Blackmore, I have served under Lord Thornfield for 2 years and have found him to be a man of honor who genuinely seeks to protect his people's legitimate interests rather than pursuing personal glory at their expense. If there are territorial disputes that require resolution, they can be addressed through proper diplomatic channels rather than through assassination and betrayal. The response reflected Sir Aldrich's fundamental belief that honorable men could find honorable solutions to even the most complex political problems if they were willing to prioritize justice over expedience and long-term stability over short-term advantage. His experience had taught him that those who claimed that circumstances forced them into dishonorable actions were usually simply seeking justification for choices they wanted to make for selfish reasons. Sir Aldrich, your naivety would be charming if the consequences were not so serious, Lord Blackmore replied, his voice carrying a note of condescending patience that suggested he was dealing with a child who refused to accept obvious truths about the adult world. Diplomatic channels have been exhausted, proper negotiations have failed, and continuing this conflict will result in thousands of unnecessary deaths while achieving nothing except the preservation of Lord Thornfield's stubborn pride. Your assistance in removing this obstacle would prevent a humanitarian catastrophe while advancing the cause of lasting peace throughout the region. The argument was structured to appeal to Sir Aldrich's known compassion for innocent people who suffered during military conflicts, but it also revealed Lord Blackmore's fundamental misunderstanding of the moral reasoning that guided truly honorable men. Sir Aldrich understood that good ends could never justify evil means, and that participating in assassination and betrayal would corrupt his soul regardless of whatever beneficial outcomes might allegedly result from such actions. Furthermore, Lord Blackmore continued, reaching into his robes to withdraw a scroll sealed with official wax, I have here authorization from certain highly placed individuals within the royal administration who share my concern about the regional instability that Lord Thornfield's intransigence has created. Your cooperation in this matter would not constitute rebellion against legitimate authority, but rather service to the Crown's larger strategic interests in maintaining peace and prosperity throughout the Northern Territories. The document was indeed genuine, bearing the seals of court officials who had been carefully selected for their susceptibility to bribery and their willingness to provide legal justification for actions that served Lord Blackmore's personal interests while maintaining plausible deniability about their own involvement in morally questionable activities. The existence of such authorization was designed to provide Sir Aldrich with a rationalization that would allow him to compromise his principles while maintaining the fiction that he was still serving lawful authority. Sir Aldrich studied the document carefully, his military training having taught him to evaluate evidence with the same meticulous attention he applied to tactical planning and strategic assessment. Lord Blackmore, this authorization appears to emanate from court officials who are known to be sympathetic to your political positions rather than from the king himself or from ministers whose primary loyalty is to the crown rather than to regional power brokers. Even if this document were issued by unquestionably legitimate authority, it would not compel me to participate in actions that violate the sacred oaths of knighthood that bind me to serve with honor. The response demonstrated Sir Aldrich's sophisticated understanding of both political intrigue and moral philosophy, showing that his commitment to principle was based not on naive idealism but on carefully considered conviction about the foundations of legitimate authority and proper conduct. Lord Blackmore realized that he was dealing with a more formidable opponent than he had initially anticipated, a man whose principles were grounded in genuine wisdom rather than mere stubborn pride. Sir Aldrich, Lord Blackmore said, his voice taking on a harder edge as he abandoned the pretense of reasonable persuasion in favor of more direct threats, I have offered you multiple opportunities to cooperate voluntarily in a matter that serves the greater good while preserving your own life and freedom. Your continued refusal to accept these generous terms forces me to remind you that your situation is far more precarious than you seem to understand, and that your choices affect not only yourself but others whose welfare should matter to a man of your supposedly compassionate nature. The shift in tone marked the end of the preliminary phase of negotiation and the beginning of the more serious psychological pressure that Lord Blackmore reserved for prisoners who proved resistant to gentler forms of persuasion. Sir Aldrich recognized the change and prepared himself mentally for whatever additional threats or revelations might be designed to break his resolve and force him into the kind of moral compromise that would destroy everything he had spent his life building and protecting. The heavy wooden door of the chamber swung open with a grinding of rusted hinges, and Lord Blackmore's guards dragged in a figure that caused Sir Aldrich's heart to clench with a mixture of rage and despair that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Young Thomas Ashworth stumbled into the torchlight, his face bearing the evidence of systematic beating that had left his left eye swollen shut and his lips split and bleeding. The 19-year-old squire's hands were bound behind his back, and his simple brown tunic was torn and stained with blood from wounds that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than mere interrogation. "Thomas," Sir Aldrich whispered, his voice breaking despite his efforts to maintain the dignified bearing that had sustained him through 3 days of imprisonment and psychological pressure. The sight of his young protégé battered and helpless struck him with the force of a physical blow, challenging every principle that had guided his life by forcing him to choose between abstract honor and the immediate welfare of someone who depended on his protection. Thomas raised his head with obvious effort, his one functioning eye focusing on his knight with an expression that combined relief at seeing Sir Aldrich alive with shame at his own captured condition. "Sir Aldrich," he managed to say through lips that were swollen and painful, "I told them nothing. Whatever they want from you, I gave them no information that could be used against Lord Thornfield or anyone else we have sworn to protect." The young man's declaration of loyalty, delivered despite obvious pain and the clear evidence that he had been tortured for information, demonstrated exactly the kind of principled courage that Sir Aldrich had tried to instill through years of training and example. The fact that Thomas had maintained his integrity under extreme duress made Lord Blackmore's manipulation even more morally repugnant, but it also complicated Sir Aldrich's moral calculations by proving that his squire was indeed worthy of the protection that any knight owed to those who served under his guidance. Lord Blackmore watched Sir Aldrich's reaction with the calculating attention of a man who had learned to identify the exact moment when psychological pressure achieved the desired effect on even the most resistant subjects. "As you can see, Sir Aldrich, young Thomas has proven himself to be admirably loyal to his knight and to the principles you have taught him. Unfortunately, his admirable qualities make him quite valuable as a means of encouraging your own cooperation in matters that serve the broader interests of regional stability and peace." The casual way in which Lord Blackmore discussed Thomas's torture as a tool for manipulation revealed the complete absence of moral constraint that had enabled him to build his political power through systematic exploitation of others' decency and compassion. Sir Aldrich understood that he was dealing with a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his objectives, and that any further resistance would result in escalating harm to an innocent young man whose only crime was loyalty to the ideals of knighthood. "Lord Blackmore," Sir Aldrich said, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil that threatened to break his resolve, "release Thomas immediately. He is guilty of no crime except service to a knight who has tried to live according to the oaths that bind all honorable men. If you require suffering to satisfy your political necessities, I am prepared to endure whatever torment you devise, but the boy has earned the right to live free from the consequences of my choices." The offer was exactly what Lord Blackmore had expected, demonstrating that Sir Aldrich's fundamental decency could indeed be exploited to achieve cooperation that rational argument and direct threats had failed to produce. The corrupt lord understood that truly honorable men were paradoxically easier to manipulate than purely selfish individuals, because their commitment to protecting others created vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited by those willing to harm innocents. "Sir Aldrich, your willingness to sacrifice yourself for your squire is precisely the kind of noble sentiment that makes you valuable as an ally rather than merely dangerous as an enemy," Lord Blackmore replied, his tone shifting back toward the reasonable persuasion that had characterized the earlier phases of their negotiation. "I have no desire to see young Thomas suffer unnecessarily, any more than I wish to see you waste away in these uncomfortable accommodations. The solution to both problems requires nothing more than your agreement to provide certain information that will enable a swift and relatively bloodless resolution to the political crisis that threatens this entire region." The proposal was structured to present cooperation as an act of mercy toward Thomas rather than betrayal of Lord Thornfield, allowing Sir Aldrich to rationalize his compliance as protection of the innocent rather than participation in assassination and political manipulation. Lord Blackmore had learned that even the most principled men could be induced to compromise their values if the alternative was presented as harm to those they felt responsible for protecting. Thomas struggled against his bonds, trying to speak despite the obvious pain that movement caused him. "Sir Aldrich, don't listen to him. Lord Thornfield has been good to us both, and the people of his lands trust him to protect them from exactly this kind of political manipulation. Whatever happens to me, don't betray a good man to save someone who knew the risks when he chose to serve as your squire." The young man's words reflected the same principled courage that had made Sir Aldrich respect him as more than merely a servant, but they also demonstrated that Thomas understood the broader implications of the choice his knight faced and was prepared to accept personal sacrifice rather than see his mentor compromised by concern for his welfare. The moral clarity of his position made Lord Blackmore's manipulation even more despicable, while simultaneously proving that Sir Aldrich's training had successfully instilled genuine honor in at least one member of the younger generation. Sir Aldrich looked from his tortured squire to his corrupt captor, understanding that he faced a choice that would define not only his own character but the kind of legacy he would leave for those who looked to him for guidance and example. The silence in the chamber stretched for long moments as he wrestled with competing obligations and moral imperatives that seemed to offer no solution that would preserve both his honor and Thomas's life. "Lord Blackmore," Sir Aldrich said finally, his voice carrying a new note of resolve that suggested he had reached a decision that would surprise everyone present, "I will give you my answer, but first I require assurance that Thomas will be released immediately regardless of what I choose to tell you. His suffering ends now, or this negotiation ends with it." Lord Blackmore leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who recognized that his psychological manipulation had finally achieved the desired breakthrough, confident that Sir Aldrich's demand for his squire's release was merely the first step in a negotiation that would conclude with complete cooperation in the assassination plot. "Sir Aldrich, your concern for young Thomas is commendable and demonstrates exactly the kind of compassionate leadership that makes you valuable as an ally. I am prepared to order his immediate release and provide medical attention for his injuries, provided that you offer a gesture of good faith that indicates your willingness to discuss the practical arrangements for resolving our mutual difficulties." The offer was carefully structured to create momentum toward cooperation, without requiring Lord Blackmore to surrender his primary leverage, before receiving concrete evidence that Sir Aldrich would indeed provide the intelligence necessary for the successful elimination of Lord Thornfield. Years of experience in political manipulation had taught him that even the most principled men could be gradually led into moral compromise through a series of small concessions that seemed reasonable individually, but collectively constituted complete betrayal of their original position. Sir Aldrich studied Lord Blackmore's face with the calculating attention of a military commander evaluating enemy positions before committing his forces to a decisive action. "Lord Blackmore, your willingness to release Thomas demonstrates that you understand the fundamental difference between legitimate political negotiation and the kind of criminal extortion that characterizes your current approach. I am indeed prepared to give you a gesture of good faith, but perhaps not the one you anticipate." The unexpected phrasing of Sir Aldrich's response caused Lord Blackmore to lean forward with sudden attention, recognizing that something in the knight's tone had shifted in a way that suggested the negotiation might not proceed according to his carefully laid plans. Thomas also raised his head, sensing that his mentor was about to make a decision that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of their captivity. "My gesture of good faith, Lord Blackmore, is this simple truth. I would rather die in these chains with my honor intact than live as a free man who has betrayed the trust of those who deserve my loyalty," Sir Aldrich declared, his voice ringing with the conviction of a man who had finally recognized that some principles were indeed worth more than life itself. "You may torture Thomas, you may torture me, you may devise whatever cruel punishments your imagination can conceive, but you will never receive my cooperation in actions that violate the sacred oaths that define my identity as a knight and as a man." The absolute finality of Sir Aldrich's rejection struck Lord Blackmore like a physical blow, challenging his fundamental assumptions about human nature and the universal susceptibility of even honorable men to pressure that threatened those they cared about. For the first time in decades of political manipulation, he found himself facing someone whose commitment to principle proved stronger than his attachment to life, comfort, or even the welfare of others. "Furthermore," Sir Aldrich continued, his voice growing stronger as he embraced the moral clarity that came from choosing principle over expedience. "I call upon you, Lord Blackmore, to examine your own conscience and consider whether the power you have accumulated through systematic betrayal and manipulation has brought you the kind of satisfaction that comes from living according to worthy principles. You have the opportunity even now to choose a different path, to release both Thomas and myself, and to seek honorable solutions to whatever political problems you face." The challenge was delivered not with the desperate bravado of a doomed man seeking to score final points against his captor, but with the genuine compassion of someone who recognized that Lord Blackmore's moral corruption had ultimately harmed him more than any of his victims. Sir Aldrich understood that those who built their power through systematic betrayal of others inevitably destroyed their own capacity for the kind of authentic relationships and genuine satisfaction that made life worth living. Lord Blackmore's face flushed red with a mixture of rage and something that might have been shame as he processed the knight's unexpected response to his carefully crafted manipulation. "Sir Aldrich, your noble speeches will not save young Thomas from the consequences of your stubborn pride, nor will they preserve you from suffering that will continue until you develop the practical wisdom necessary to distinguish between abstract idealism and genuine responsibility for those who depend on your decisions." The threat was delivered with the frustrated anger of a man whose fundamental worldview had been challenged by evidence that some people truly were willing to choose principle over survival, but it also revealed Lord Blackmore's growing desperation as he realized that his most effective psychological weapon had failed to achieve the desired result. Sir Aldrich's refusal to be manipulated through concern for Thomas's welfare forced him to consider more direct and potentially counterproductive forms of coercion. Thomas struggled to speak despite his injuries, his voice weak but clear in its moral conviction. "Lord Blackmore, Sir Aldrich speaks truly when he says that honor is worth more than life. I would rather die knowing that my knight maintained his integrity than live knowing that good men can be forced to betray their principles through threats against those they seek to protect. Your power depends on the willingness of decent people to compromise their values for practical advantage, but some things cannot be purchased at any price." The young squire's declaration of support for his mentor's position demonstrated that Sir Aldrich's moral example had indeed inspired genuine commitment to principle in the next generation, creating a legacy that would outlast whatever physical punishment Lord Blackmore might inflict. The sight of both knight and squire choosing potential death over moral compromise represented exactly the kind of principled courage that corrupt men found most threatening to their worldview. "Very well," Lord Blackmore said, rising from his chair with the ominous deliberation of a man who had decided to abandon psychological manipulation in favor of more direct and brutal methods of persuasion. "Since appeals to your compassion and your practical intelligence have proven ineffective, perhaps more concrete demonstrations of the consequences of defiance will help clarify the choices available to you." Sir Aldrich met Lord Blackmore's gaze with the steady courage of a man who had made peace with whatever suffering might come, understanding that he had chosen the only path that would allow him to maintain his identity as a knight and as an honorable man. The approaching escalation held no terror for him, because he had already achieved the most important victory by refusing to compromise the principles that gave his life meaning and purpose. Lord Blackmore's composure cracked completely as he realized that traditional methods of coercion had failed against a man whose commitment to principle exceeded his attachment to life, comfort, or even the welfare of those he sought to protect. The corrupt lord's face contorted with rage as he contemplated the possibility that decades of successful manipulation might prove inadequate against someone who genuinely valued honor more than survival, challenging his fundamental beliefs about human nature and the universal power of properly applied pressure. "Guards!" Lord Blackmore shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the chamber with the frustrated fury of a predator whose carefully planned hunt had been thwarted by prey that refused to behave according to established patterns. "Bring the implements we discussed earlier. Since Sir Aldrich has chosen to prioritize abstract principles over practical reality, perhaps more concrete forms of persuasion will help him develop the wisdom necessary to make rational decisions about his situation." The guards who entered the chamber carried instruments that had been designed specifically to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims conscious and capable of coherent communication, tools that Lord Blackmore had acquired through consultation with interrogators whose expertise in breaking human will had been refined through years of systematic experimentation on political prisoners. The sight of these devices was intended to achieve through anticipation of suffering what rational argument and emotional manipulation had failed to accomplish through direct appeal. Sir Aldrich observed the approaching torture implements with the detached calm of a warrior who had faced death in battle countless times and had learned to accept whatever fate awaited him with dignity and courage. "Lord Blackmore, you may indeed succeed in breaking my body through the application of sufficient pain, but you will find that a man's honor, once firmly established, cannot be destroyed through physical suffering. The principles that guide my choices are not stored in my flesh where they might be extracted through torture, but in my soul where they remain beyond your reach." The knight's response demonstrated a level of spiritual preparation that Lord Blackmore had not anticipated, suggesting that Sir Aldrich possessed the kind of deep philosophical foundation that enabled some men to transcend physical limitations when their core values were threatened. The corrupt lord began to understand that he was dealing with an opponent whose strength derived from sources that his materialistic worldview had never taught him to recognize or counter effectively. Thomas, despite his own injuries and the obvious threat that the torture instruments represented to his own welfare, found the strength to speak in support of his mentor's position. "Sir Aldrich has taught me that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict suffering on others, but from the willingness to endure whatever hardships are necessary to maintain one's integrity. Lord Blackmore, your torture devices may break our bodies, but they cannot touch the principles that make life worth living." The young squire's declaration revealed that Sir Aldrich's moral example had indeed created a legacy that would survive whatever physical destruction Lord Blackmore might inflict, proving that genuine honor possessed a kind of immortality that transcended individual survival. The sight of both knight and squire prepared to face torture rather than compromise their values represented exactly the kind of moral courage that corrupt men found most threatening to their worldview and their power. "Sir Aldrich," Lord Blackmore said, his voice now carrying the cold menace of a man who had abandoned all pretense of reasonable negotiation in favor of pure intimidation, "you speak eloquently of honor and principle, but I wonder how long your philosophical convictions will sustain you when you are forced to watch young Thomas suffer for your stubborn refusal to cooperate in a matter that serves the greater good. Perhaps your conscience will prove more flexible when confronted with the practical consequences of your idealistic stance." The threat to torture Thomas while forcing Sir Aldrich to watch represented Lord Blackmore's final attempt to find psychological leverage that would break the knight's resistance by exploiting his sense of responsibility for those under his protection. The corrupt lord understood that even the most principled men sometimes proved willing to compromise their own integrity to prevent suffering by innocent parties, and he was prepared to escalate the physical and emotional pressure until he achieved the cooperation he required. Sir Aldrich closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself for what he knew would be the most difficult test of his commitment to principle that he had ever faced. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady and filled with a resolve that had been tempered by years of military service and moral reflection. "Lord Blackmore, if you choose to torture Thomas in an attempt to break my will, you will succeed only in proving that your corruption has destroyed your capacity for basic human decency. Thomas and I both understand the risks that come with serving honor rather than expedience, and we have both chosen to accept those risks rather than compromise the principles that define our identity." The response was delivered with such calm certainty that even Lord Blackmore's guards exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience of interrogation and coercion. The sight of two men prepared to face extreme suffering rather than betray their values challenged assumptions about human nature that had guided their understanding of how power operated and what methods could be relied upon to achieve compliance from resistant subjects. "However," Sir Aldrich continued, his voice taking on a new quality that suggested he was about to reveal something that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of their confrontation, "before you proceed with whatever brutality you believe necessary to achieve your goals, there is something you should understand about the true nature of the choice you are making and the consequences that will follow from the path you have chosen to pursue." Lord Blackmore's composure cracked completely as he realized that traditional methods of coercion had failed against a man whose commitment to principle exceeded his attachment to life, comfort, or even the welfare of those he sought to protect. The corrupt lord's face contorted with rage as he contemplated the possibility that decades of successful manipulation might prove inadequate against someone who genuinely valued honor more than survival, challenging his fundamental beliefs about human nature and the universal power of properly applied pressure. "Guards!" Lord Blackmore shouted. his voice echoing off the stone walls of the chamber with the frustrated fury of a predator whose carefully planned hunt had been thwarted by prey that refused to behave according to established patterns. Bring the implements we discussed earlier. Since Sir Aldrich has chosen to prioritize abstract principles over practical reality, perhaps more concrete forms of persuasion will help him develop the wisdom necessary to make rational decisions about his situation. The guards who entered the chamber carried instruments that had been designed specifically to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims conscious and capable of coherent communication, tools that Lord Blackmore had acquired through consultation with interrogators whose expertise in breaking human will had been refined through years of systematic experimentation on political prisoners. The sight of these devices was intended to achieve through anticipation of suffering what rational argument and emotional manipulation had failed to accomplish through direct appeal. Sir Aldrich observed the approaching torture implements with the detached calm of a warrior who had faced death in battle countless times and had learned to accept whatever fate awaited him with dignity and courage. Lord Blackmore, you may indeed succeed in breaking my body through the application of sufficient pain, but you will find that a man's honor, once firmly established, cannot be destroyed through physical suffering. The principles that guide my choices are not stored in my flesh where they might be extracted through torture, but in my soul where they remain beyond your reach. The knight's response demonstrated a level of spiritual preparation that Lord Blackmore had not anticipated, suggesting that Sir Aldrich possessed the kind of deep philosophical foundation that enabled some men to transcend physical limitations when their core values were threatened. The corrupt lord began to understand that he was dealing with an opponent whose strength derived from sources that his materialistic worldview had never taught him to recognize or counter effectively. Thomas, despite his own injuries and the obvious threat that the torture instruments represented to his own welfare, found the strength to speak in support of his mentor's position. Sir Aldrich has taught me that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict suffering on others, but from the willingness to endure whatever hardships are necessary to maintain one's integrity. Lord Blackmore, your torture devices may break our bodies, but they cannot touch the principles that make life worth living. The young squire's declaration revealed that Sir Aldrich's moral example had indeed created a legacy that would survive whatever physical destruction Lord Blackmore might inflict, proving that genuine honor possessed a kind of immortality that transcended individual survival. The sight of both knight and squire prepared to face torture rather than compromise their values represented exactly the kind of moral courage that corrupt men found most threatening to their worldview and their power. Sir Aldrich, Lord Blackmore said, his voice now carrying the cold menace of a man who had abandoned all pretense of reasonable negotiation in favor of pure intimidation. You speak eloquently of honor and principle, but I wonder how long your philosophical convictions will sustain you when you are forced to watch young Thomas suffer for your stubborn refusal to cooperate in a matter that serves the greater good. Perhaps your conscience will prove more flexible when confronted with the practical consequences of your idealistic stance. The threat to torture Thomas while forcing Sir Aldrich to watch represented Lord Blackmore's final attempt to find psychological leverage that would break the knight's resistance by exploiting his sense of responsibility for those under his protection. The corrupt lord understood that even the most principled men sometimes proved willing to compromise their own integrity to prevent suffering by innocent parties, and he was prepared to escalate the physical and emotional pressure until he achieved the cooperation he required. Sir Aldrich closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself for what he knew would be the most difficult test of his commitment to principle that he had ever faced. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady and filled with a resolve that had been tempered by years of military service and moral reflection. Lord Blackmore, if you choose to torture Thomas in an attempt to break my will, you will succeed only in proving that your corruption has destroyed your capacity for basic human decency. Thomas and I both understand the risks that come with serving honor rather than expedience, and we have both chosen to accept those risks rather than compromise the principles that define our identity. The response was delivered with such calm certainty that even Lord Blackmore's guards exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience of interrogation and coercion. The sight of two men prepared to face extreme suffering rather than betray their values challenged assumptions about human nature that had guided their understanding of how power operated and what methods could be relied upon to achieve compliance from resistant subjects. However, Sir Aldrich continued, his voice taking on a new quality that suggested he was about to reveal something that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of their confrontation, before you proceed with whatever brutality you believe necessary to achieve your goals. There is something you should understand about the true nature of the choice you are making and the consequences that will follow from the path you have chosen to pursue. The rescue that followed moved with the swift efficiency of a military operation planned by experienced commanders who understood both the tactical requirements of liberating prisoners and the political necessities of ensuring that justice was served according to proper legal procedures. Sir Aldrich and Thomas were freed from their bonds and provided immediate medical attention, while Lord Blackmore found himself facing the same kind of iron shackles that had held his victims during their ordeal in the stone chamber beneath Thornwall Castle. "Sir Aldrich," Captain Ironhold said as he personally supervised the knight's release, "Lord Thornfield sends his profound apologies for the suffering you have endured and his deepest gratitude for your unwavering loyalty in the face of impossible pressure. Your refusal to betray his trust, even under threat of torture and death, exemplifies the highest ideals of knighthood and serves as an inspiration to all who serve the cause of honor and justice." The words carried special weight coming from a fellow military professional who understood exactly what Sir Aldrich had faced and the magnitude of the moral courage required to choose principle over survival when confronted with systematic torture and manipulation. Captain Ironhold's respect was evident not just in his formal words but in the careful attention he gave to ensuring that both knight and squire received proper care for their injuries. 6 months later, Sir Aldrich stood before King Aldwin in the throne room of the royal palace, wearing new armor that bore the distinctive markings of the royal guard and carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through his ordeal and ultimate vindication. His appointment to this elite position represented both recognition of his demonstrated loyalty and the king's desire to surround himself with men whose principles had been tested under the most extreme circumstances. "Sir Aldrich," King Aldwin announced to the assembled court, "your courage in refusing to betray Lord Thornfield despite facing torture and death has demonstrated the kind of moral strength that forms the foundation of just governance and honorable leadership. The word "no" that you spoke in that dungeon has become a rallying cry for all who believe that some principles are indeed worth more than life itself." The ceremony was attended by nobles from throughout the kingdom who had come to witness the elevation of a knight whose story had already become legendary as an example of how individual moral courage could triumph over systematic corruption and political manipulation. Thomas Ashworth, now fully recovered from his injuries and promoted to full knighthood in recognition of his own courage, stood proudly beside his former mentor as they both received honors that acknowledged their sacrifice and their integrity. Lord Blackmore, meanwhile, had been tried and convicted on multiple charges of treason and corruption, his vast estates confiscated and redistributed to administrators who served the Crown's interests rather than their own enrichment. His network of complicit officials had been systematically investigated and either reformed or replaced, creating a more transparent and accountable system of regional governance that protected honest people from the kind of systematic exploitation that had characterized his rule. "The lesson that Sir Aldrich has taught us all," King Aldwin continued, "is that true strength lies not in the ability to force others into moral compromise, but in the courage to maintain one's own principles regardless of the consequences." His simple word "no" proved more powerful than all of Lord Blackmore's threats and manipulation, because it represented an unshakable commitment to values that transcend personal survival and political expedience. The story of Sir Aldrich's refusal to betray his honor spread throughout the kingdom and beyond, inspiring other knights and nobles to examine their own moral foundations and consider whether they possessed the kind of principled courage that could withstand the pressures of political corruption and personal advantage. His example proved that individual acts of moral courage could indeed change the course of history when they inspired others to similar acts of integrity and honor. Years later, when young knights took their sacred oaths of service, they were reminded of Sir Aldrich's story and the power of a simple word spoken with absolute conviction. "No" had become more than just a refusal of corrupt demands. It had become a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit and the eternal power of principle over pragmatism. Thomas, now Sir Thomas Ashworth, established a training academy for young knights where Sir Aldrich's story was taught as the fundamental example of how honor could triumph over intimidation when backed by unshakable moral conviction. The academy's motto, inscribed above its main entrance, consisted of a single word that captured the essence of their founder's philosophy, "No," representing the power of principled refusal to compromise one's values regardless of the consequences. Sir Aldrich himself continued to serve in the Royal Guard for many years, his presence a constant reminder to the king and his advisers that some counselors could be trusted to speak truth regardless of political considerations or personal cost. His simple refusal to betray his honor had not only saved his own soul but had helped create a more just and honorable system of governance that would benefit countless others for generations to come.